It's a little bit difficult for me because in a way it's a sort of self-outing to some extent. I'm just going to share some thoughts with everybody on Jewish historiography, which technically is the methods of doing historical research on Jews. Okay, so historiography wants to look at the ways that people conduct their research on Jewish history. And so I say familiar thoughts of 6 problems of researching American Jewish past in lieu of race, because my family narrative, as you're going to see, is kind of undergirding this presentation. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say I feel like I'm a little bit self-out. Okay, so we're going to go through 6 problems. This is the first problem. The historians believe that mixtures, racial, gender, ethnic, etc., inherently comprise marginal, not basic, features of an American Jewish historicity. You have to begin, if you want to do research in Jewish historiography, with the assumption that people, all people, are inherently mixed. You have to begin with that assumption, because if you don't, you end up with some fundamental problems that we're going to explore. Now, here's a picture of me. You know what? Is it possible to I mean, I know I'm dark, but all right, that's a little bit better. Thank you very much. Okay, here's me, right? And I appear in public in certain ways, right? However, this is a photograph of my immediate family during Thanksgiving. So instantaneously, you should be able to see that there's a little bit of dissonance between how I might appear in public in terms of race, how other people might think of me in terms of race, and how I think of myself in terms of race, right? And so this is a part of my family heritage. It's something that we cherish. Here's a photograph of my wedding. I was married 3 years and 4 months ago. And you know, you can see we're all having a wonderful time. However, mixtures, while basic, often imply some sort of tension and conflict in history. Now, the good thing about historiography is that it can help uncover important features of these mixtures and conflicts as they relate to Jewish existence. But as we can see here, inasmuch as it predetermines social roles of whiteness for Jews and blackness for Africans and other people designated as property, slavery had a profound historic impact on American Jewry's negotiations of racial assignment. And here you see the advertisement by J.F. Moses, a Jewish person who's involved in the trafficking of African people. This leads to a second problem. If you don't begin your work as a Jewish historian or a historian of Jews with mixture, you don't begin your analysis with mixture, then you're unable to acknowledge the influence of historically constituted, racially segregated institutions. If you don't assume that mixture is a part of your analysis, you can't deal with segregation. So usually when historians talk about Jews and slavery, they talk about Jewish plantations as sites of racism, but Jewish plantations have a historical force to them that affect how we behave in the present, including congregations, as I say, yeshivot, Jewish communal organizations. Bertram Korn is a very influential historian in this respect. He played a commanding role in pioneering research on Jews and race in terms of American Jewish historiography. And more recent works of scholars such as Paula Hyman, Eli Faber, Hasia Diner, Mordecai Arbo, Jonathan Shorsh, and Aviv Ben-Ur have expanded this groundwork, but his ideas on race, and Rabbi Korn was actually a rabbi in Elkins Park here in Philadelphia for a number of years. His ideas on the racial contours of Jewish historiography have remained influential. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a correspondence that took place between Rabbi Korn and some rabbis in the Caribbean back in the late 60s to examine what he means by these contours. Let me give you some background. He was lecturing in New York at the time, and he was lecturing on Jews and slavery, and one of his students raised their hand and said, Rabbi Korn, you know, I know a bunch of people from the Caribbean, and they have some Jewish-sounding last names, but you don't say anything about them. Rabbi Korn couldn't answer the question. So in response to the student's question, what Rabbi Korn did is he sent letters to the rabbis in Panama, Jamaica, Curacao, St. Thomas, to these places in the Caribbean and said, well, tell me about these black people in your congregations. I'm going to read well, we'll get to it. This came from the rabbi in Curacao. He says, "Dear Dr. Korn, to the best of my knowledge, there is no Negro Jew in Suriname and probably in Jamaica, Panama, and St. Thomas. However, excuse me, that's slow down. I am, however, not sure of it. I believe there are thousands of mulattoes of Jewish descent who can trace their Jewish ancestors up to 4 and 5 generations back, but there are many today who are the grandsons and even the sons and daughters of Jews. They are usually Catholic, at least nominally, or agnostic. Many of them, no doubt, would probably consider the possibility of joining the Jewish community if it were not for the fact that the Jews of Curacao always excluded them in the past and would probably not mix with them anyway." Now, when the rabbi of Curacao talks about excluding them in the past, he's talking about the fact that during slavery, there were rabbinic decisions made on how to police Jewish communities along lines of race, to the extent that black Jews could not be members of many of these congregations and synagogues. Mulatto Jews had a little bit more opportunity to be participating members, but white Jews, assuming you were male, and especially if you were male and you had some money, could definitely participate in the life of these congregations. Since I converted Yishmael Francisca, I've been asked 3 times to say a prayer at the dedication of a new home of these Antillean Anusim. Anusim is a word the rabbis use to refer to Jews who, for whatever reason, historically, have not been allowed to publicly express their Jewish identity, right? And one of them is studying Hebrew with me. These facts are true to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not afraid to mention them, but the members of my community do not like to hear about them. They would surely prefer to ignore them. I've tried to do my best not to antagonize them with these matters, but I think it would be a great injustice if they were not to be included in the general history of the Jews of the Netherlands, Antilles, etc. Pay attention to Rabbi Korn's response. "I'm grateful to you for your letter of May 14th, but as you may know from my paper on Jews and slavery, there is evidence that there was only one Negro who regarded himself as a Jew, a man who attended services in Charleston. Otherwise, consistently, the Jewish fathers of mulatto children demonstrated no interest in giving them a Jewish education or in rearing them as Jews or identifying them as such." So this is interesting. Rabbi Korn is the one that asked the question. But when he got the response from the rabbi in Curacao, he didn't like the response. So he actually reiterated scholarship that he had already admitted, didn't respond to his original question. But look what happens in the relationship of the discourse between the Jamaican rabbi. He's all proud. He says, "In reply to your inquiry, I would inform you that there are a few Negro and mulatto members in my congregation. To give some examples, one seems to have originated in the Harlem community of Rabbi Wentworth Matthew." Shout out to the so-called black Hebrews, right? "Another is a boy who was recently bar mitzvah. He is the son of an ex-Auschwitz Polish Jewess and a Seventh-day Adventist Negro doctor. Others, including a few Chinese, have been converted by me." So Rabbi Hooker of Kingston Synagogue is proud, right? He's just like, yeah, we have diversity. Look at Korn's response. "I want to be sure I am correct in assuming that no one, to your knowledge, has been a Jamaican Jewish Negro or mulatto for more than this generation, nor does anyone claim to be Jewish through parents or grandparentage." Look at what happened.
Yes.
You see the move that he's making?
Yes.
When he asks about historical Jewish presence in the present, he gets the response that he wasn't expecting. And so he makes this move to say, well, simply because we encounter black Jews in our daily lives in the present doesn't necessarily mean that there is such a thing as a historical black Jewish presence, right? Now this is going to play a dominant role in the scholarship. Now watch the response of the rabbi from Jamaica. "It is correct to state that no one has been a Jamaican Jewish Negro for more than this generation, although a number of Negro non-Jews often tell me they're of Jewish extraction. It is a little more difficult to be agnostic about mulattoes." He wrote this, hand-wrote it, all capital letters, to emphasize his point. "Since there are so many degrees of mixed race here, mixed blood here, but I would say that's probably true of them too. A researcher may be able to discover a few exceptions." Rabbi Korn responds back. "Obviously, there is no evidence of any Jamaican Negro who has been a Jew." So I mean, I took a few minutes to get through the point, but you see the problem. right? The problem is that the assumptions driving historical research into American Jews have excluded people from the beginning. And so when you start not appreciating mixture, and you start not being able to deal with segregated, racially segregated institutions, then you can't deal with problem number 3, which is ignorance of the familial consequences of segregation. It's not like these institutions just merely existed out of happenstance. People began to create family lives that would enable them to respond to these racist institutions in particular ways, right? So usually when people do research on Jews, they point to people like the Cardozo brothers, right? These are the sons of a very famous judge, and both of them, to my knowledge, were practicing Christians for at least part of their lives, and they'll say, look, if you had miscegenation during slavery, this is the paradigm. This is what happens. They assimilate, they become Christians, and they have no consciousness of Judaism, usually without asking, mind you. They just assume. They have no connection to a Jewish past whatsoever. That doesn't explain people like, and I love this slide, Skin Watux. This is an artist representation of a woman who was known as Elizabeth Friedlander. And one of the things that people who do scholarship in religious studies know, but very few people talk about, is for hundreds of years, there was a theological belief that Native Americans, or whatever tribe, were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. There was this belief. But what people don't realize is that because that belief existed, you had people who were Jews immigrating to the New World, intermarrying with Native Americans, starting families, and then raising children as Jews under the pretext of that belief. So even though it's theologically not popular today, you have to bracket that theological prejudice if you want to do research on the history of Jews in the New World. So now you have people like these folks who are in my family. This gentleman is my great-grandfather. This is this is Grandpa Will Taylor. He was Creek, and his relationship to Judaism is in dispute in my family. He has a daughter. This is her right here, Jessie. Try not to say her name. This is my grandmother, okay? No one disputes the fact that she's a Jew. Matter of fact, that's the only thing I know about my grandmother. She died when my father was 2, okay? Everybody knows she's also Native American. This gentleman here is a cousin of mine. His name is Jerry. He owns a cabinet-making business a couple blocks away from the Jamaican synagogue where Rabbi Hooker was writing to Rabbi Korn from. And I went to Jamaica to have a conversation with my relatives about this issue because I wanted to know, like, what was the historical relationship between these Anusim, these black Anusim, and the synagogues? And it was exactly my upbringing. He said, look, everybody knows we're Jew. He considers himself a Jew. She considers herself a Jew. There's no doubt about that. But even though he attended services, even though he participated in religious observances, he was not formally a member, right? And so he wasn't considered a part of the Jewish community. So the question for scholars is, how do these people do this? Like, how do you go through history and transmit identities transgenerationally without institutional mechanisms to support that identity? And I think they do 3 basic things. I think they learn the rules of assimilation, they learn their relationship to those rules, and then they perform social roles that allow a maximum of kind of self-outing with a minimum of social pain, and for the Durkheimians in the room, anomie. Now, the rules of assimilation are very simple. You conform to what the culture says, you get accepted, and the more you're accepted, the more you're allowed to conform, okay? However, there are times when those rules of assimilation do not apply, such as in my circumstance. What I did is I just made this little graph here to try to illustrate a little bit of what I'm trying to get across, right? So I just chose 3 cultural vectors that comprise what I consider my own conception of self, right? One is what I call Native Americana, one's Jewish Americana, one's African Americana. And you think that the person I think is me is where those 3 shades overlap. And generally, that's true. That's where I feel most comfortable in terms of cultural spaces. But this is the trick. What appears on the stage of history, what can be documented, what can be researched by the historian, oftentimes tends to be what's in this space right here and what the dominant culture says is permissible. So for me, for example, let's take Jewish burials. I would like to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. That sounds cool to me. My understanding of my cultural background puts my desire to be buried in a Jewish cemetery in this space, right? However, if I lived in a society which said that if you're a Negro, you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemeteries are white-only spaces, then I, as a historian, am not going to go to the Jewish cemetery to look for a historical relic of my existence as a Jew. I would go to non-traditional places like this building, which has a lot of personal significance for me. Although I've never seen it, it doesn't exist anymore, it's in the middle of Florida. This is an old missionary Baptist church, behind which was the colored cemetery during the days of Jim Crow. This is where my Egyptian Sephardic Jewish grandfather is buried, okay? So for me, that is a sacred space. It's a Jewish space for obvious reasons, but publicly, it doesn't appear on the stage of history as such, okay? Now that raises problem number 4, and so we're going to try to speed along through the next 3 problems. The presumed adequacy of classical Christian and Euro-Jewish theological language for purposes of historiography, okay? We cannot allow our religious biases to control what we do in terms of our research. Here is a marriage license for my great-uncle. My great-uncle Saul, who was a man who could pass. He was Sephardic as the day he was born. But look at the language on this marriage license, even though it's a state document, to any ordained or licensed minister of the gospel, right? So you know Christian language is functioning as hegemonic, even though it's a government-endorsed document. Saul Isaac and Pauline Dottenheim. The reason I know that my great-uncle Saul could pass as a historian, the reason I know. Look who signs the document. The above name were married by me, Reverend Dr. R. Farber, Rabbi. Okay? Nowadays, you don't have too many rabbis describing themselves publicly as a Reverend Doctor, right? That's considered to be Christian terminology. But for the 18th and 19th century Jews in this country, they often used Christian language to express, to negotiate through the dominant society. And so here, the fact that you have somebody put rabbi on a marriage license is evidence not necessarily of the Jewishness of the people only, but also of their whiteness, okay? It's evidence of both. Now, this is my great-granddad's marriage license. Now look at the language, it's the same. To any licensed minister of the gospel in regular communion with the Christian church or society of which he is a member. Jonas Isaac, Mary Davis. Joseph Davis, Judge Davis, officiating minister. You see what's going on? If you were to look at this document and just read the words, you would assume that the people involved were Christians. But they're not Christians, they're Jews. And I know this because, not only because of what I was told and that I'm telling you, they were able to get this marriage done because this gentleman, Joseph Davis, was actually a white Jew. Mary Davis was a white Jewish woman who could pass. Because this was a mixed marriage, this actually comprised an illegal document at the time. Okay? And so now you have situations like this. Is this my great uncle, Joe Davis? Right? Because of the negotiations of race, our family split, and now we have white Jews that don't associate with us. And you have our side of the family, and we don't associate with the white Jews. And so people transgenerationally are left with questions about our identity and place in history. The 5th problem is the neglect of non-academic documentation of African American and Native American Jewish traditions. You can do research on Jews of color in the Americas, but you have to get outside the typical academic sources. You got to get outside the archives. This woman, Rabbi Caldwell, is where's Rabbi Caldwell? He was just speaking to me about this wonderful woman named St. Rhoda Benson. She's a poet, who should be in her 90s by now. If not, she's really close to her 90s, who for most of her life actually wrote poems, but the poems described mundane Jewish religious life amongst African Americans in New England. And so when I went to her and she said, oh, I want you to transcribe some things for me, she brought out hundreds of these poems. And she's describing, what black Jews are doing during the Civil Rights Movement. She describes what black Jews were doing during World War II. She just describes what black Jews are doing during the Reagan era. These are the types of non-traditional sources that historiographers have to appeal to. An example of good work, however, is this right here. This is the remnants of a headstone, not a headstone, excuse me, a head marker at a cemetery on the Jewish plantation of Suriname in South America. Now, the woman who took this photograph is a very wonderful architect. She lives in New York now, and when she went to Suriname, what she noticed on this plantation were that many, and I'm talking hundreds, of the graves had these markers where they took Akan symbols, that is the Sankofa birds. They took Sankofa birds and overlaid them with Stars of David. Now, if somebody wants a really good dissertation project, go to Suriname and find out who made these head markers, right? This is an example of, because the cemeteries have been there for hundreds of years, this is an example of research that's gone ignored, but that can reveal a lot more about Afro-Jewish creolizations in the New World. And I use this just to see, even photographs can tell you a lot about how Jews are negotiating race, historically speaking. You can just look at this photo from the Jim Crow South and tell that new forms of cultural knowledge are being created, right? That's all you have to do is look at this photo. Okay, and so we come back to what really drove me to give this presentation in the first place, which is my assumption that wherever you go, wherever you find Jews, you're going to find mixture. And if you want to do some really good historiographic work, don't take the approach that people have in the past, that assuming that simply because Jewish institutions may or may not be segregated today, that they were always that way. No, assume that wherever Jews go, they mix, they combine, they blend, they create new traditions, and they create meanings for themselves. If anyone has any more questions, I think we can just go ahead and move over to the question and answer session. Thank you very much.